Hey guys, tonight we're going to open the heavy bronze doors of a Roman imperial palace not to find an emperor, a general, or a senator, but someone far smaller, quieter, and long erased. A boy with curls too perfect to be natural, taught to smile on command, to walk behind the emperor without making a sound, and to vanish just as easily when no longer useful. Before we sink into sleep, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy what I'm doing here. And let me know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is. I love seeing the whole map light up. Now, dim the lights. Maybe crack a window for that night breeze. And let's begin tonight's story. So let me ask you this. Have you ever walked through a museum filled with marble statues and wondered about the real people behind the stone? Some faces look powerful, others divine. But then you see a soft, delicate face, a boy, eternally young, carved with strange intimacy. That's not a prince. That's not a god. That's a pure delicatus, a delicate boy, as they were called. These boys were chosen, though. That's a generous word, to serve Roman emperors, not as pages, not as students, as something more troubling. Their lives were crafted for beauty and silence, and most of their stories have been buried beneath the imperial myth for over 1,000 years. The Roman Empire knew how to keep secrets. It also knew how to use people as symbols, as pleasures, as pawns. The pueri delicati were sometimes all three. Typically between the ages of 8 and 14, these boys were handpicked for their looks: blonde curls, pale skin, slender frames. If this already sounds uncomfortable, that's because it is, but it's real history. These children were brought into the palaces not to learn or rise, but to accompany emperors, sometimes on display, sometimes behind closed doors. They might serve wine at a feast, dance at ceremonies, or simply be there, like decoration. But their real purpose was rarely just ornamental. They were often slaves, either bought, captured in wars, or sent as exotic gifts from the provinces. A defeated tribal king hoping to curry favor might send his prettiest child to Rome, and the emperor's court, in all its opulence and cold grandeur, would receive the boy like a luxury good. No one asked him if he wanted to be there. He was groomed, trained, and if necessary, reshaped into what the emperor desired. In some cases, literally reshaped. Castration was not uncommon. Eunuchs were thought to be obedient, safe, and aesthetically pleasing. They would never grow into threatening men. They would never rebel. They were arrested in youth forever. The most famous of these boys in recorded history was Sporus. He served the Emperor Nero, one of the most theatrically cruel rulers in Roman history. After Nero's wife, Poppaea, died, some say, by his own hands, he found Sporus, a young boy who looked remarkably like her. Nero had Sporus castrated and married him in a public ceremony, calling him his wife. They appeared together in public events, with Sporus dressed in royal women's robes, silent and wide-eyed beside the mad emperor. It wasn't love, it was obsession. It was theater, and for Sporus, it was likely a nightmare he could never wake from. But Sporus wasn't alone. These boys existed for centuries, spanning reigns from Augustus to Constantine. Sometimes they were private favorites, sometimes they were political tools. They might be adored, adorned with jewels, given soft pillows and golden sandals, but at their core, they were still property. Their feelings were rarely recorded. Their names often lost. They were ghost children in velvet, trained to flatter the most dangerous men in the world. Why don't we hear more about them in history books? Well, here's the twist. After Christianity took over the Roman world, the church had to do some editing. You can't build a moral empire on stories of emperors marrying castrated boys. So over time, the records of the pueri delicati were pushed out, buried, or painted over with euphemisms. They became footnotes, misinterpreted statues, or just disappeared entirely. By the Middle Ages, most people had no idea these boys ever existed. It wasn't until Renaissance scholars started poking through old letters, dusty scrolls, and awkward statues that hints began to reemerge. But even then, modern historians have tiptoed around the topic. Why? Because it's messy, because it makes us uncomfortable, because it forces us to confront how power, beauty, and cruelty can wrap themselves around children and how society can be complicit in forgetting them. So tonight, in this quiet moment, I want you to remember them. The footsteps in the marble halls, the soft songs sung under candlelight, the frightened eyes that met the emperor's gaze. History didn't write their stories in golden ink. It tried not to write them at all. But they were real. And tonight, you've heard the first whisper of their truth. You've probably heard the phrase, history is written by the victors. But sometimes, history isn't written at all, it's erased. The boys who served Roman emperors, the pueri delicati, lived in some of the most opulent halls the world has ever known. They walked past golden columns and ivory statues. Their sandals touched mosaic floors that told stories of gods. And yet we know almost nothing about them, not because they were unimportant, but because their existence was inconvenient, disturbing, embarrassing to later generations who preferred their Roman history full of battle glories and Latin poetry, not child courtiers draped in silk. So who exactly were the pueri delicati? In Latin, puer simply means boy. Delicatus means tender, charming, or more directly delicate. And that word is important. They weren't chosen for strength or cleverness. They were chosen for softness. Their primary currency was beauty. Imagine being valued for your eyelashes, your cheeks, your ability to appear serene even when terrified. These boys could come from anywhere in the empire. They were Greek, Syrian, Gaulish, African. British Rome was a sponge that soaked up the world, and sometimes it wrung out its children for display. There were three main ways these boys entered imperial service. First, through conquest. When Rome crushed a rebellion or absorbed a new province, children were often taken as slaves. The finest, most exotic ones according to Roman tastes were plucked out and sent to elite households. From there, if they caught the right eye, they might end up in the emperor's palace. The second route was gift-giving. Ambitious governors, senators, or allied kings sometimes offered beautiful boys as tribute, hoping to curry favor. It sounds horrific, and it was, but this was a world where people were traded as political gestures, no different from marble or silk. The third path was internal grooming. Wealthy Roman households often trained attractive young slaves in music, dance, etiquette, and grooming, not out of kindness, but as a form of human investment. A boy who could recite Virgil, serve tea with perfect timing, and play the lyre with a melancholy smile had value. Some of these boys were later promoted to imperial service. Of course, promotion is a misleading word when the job might involve being paraded like a trophy or worse. Let's stop for a moment and be very clear. Not all of these boys were necessarily victims of sexual abuse, but many were. Ancient sources, uncomfortable as they are, occasionally hint at these dynamics without naming them directly. The ambiguity can be worse than certainty. You're left wondering what was left unsaid, what a Roman historian chose not to describe, what was considered so normal. It didn't even need explanation. Now, you might be wondering, were these boys ever Roman citizens? The answer is rarely. Most were slaves. A few may have been freedmen or the children of freedmen. There are scattered references to boys born into noble households who later served in intimate roles at court. But those are exceptional cases and often tied to scandal. The general rule was, if you were young, pretty, powerless, and male, you were at risk of being drawn into this silent world. Interestingly, there was no official rank or title for pueri delicati. They weren't legally recognized as a class, like the senators or the equestrians. This allowed their status to remain fluid and disposable. They could be lavishly dressed one day and discarded the next, with no paperwork to track their fate. Some were given jewels, silk tunics, even poems. Others were simply forgotten. We know from later writers like Suetonius and Dio Cassius that some emperors had dozens of these boys at once. They were like moving wallpaper, always present, rarely noticed in official records. Let's take a small detour into Roman attitudes toward youth and beauty. In Roman culture, youth, especially male youth, was not just admired. It was idealized. Statues of young Apollo, Ganymede, and Antinous adorned gardens and baths. These images weren't just art. They were aesthetic ideals. The androgynous beauty of a young boy, balanced between childhood and manhood, was considered almost divine. That ideal bled into reality. The pure delicatus became a living sculpture, someone to be admired, touched, paraded. But unlike stone, they could feel, they could fear, they could suffer. And yet, for all their visibility, they had no voice. We have almost no first-person accounts from these boys. No letters, no diaries. What we know comes from the sidelines, from satirists like Juvenal, who mocked emperors for their debauchery, from moralists like Seneca, who condemned excess, or from Christian writers who used these stories as cautionary tales. But none of those sources asked what the boys themselves wanted. They didn't care whether the smile on a boy's face was practiced in fear. Why does that silence matter? Because history tends to echo. Whenever a group is denied a voice, its humanity fades in the public imagination. It becomes easier to joke about, easier to ignore. And in the case of the pueri delicati, the silence became so thick that most modern people have never even heard of them. They've been pushed out of view by more heroic narratives. We remember Caesar crossing the Rubicon. We forget the child who handed him his helmet. Some historians argue that these boys weren't all victims, that some rose to real influence. Even power. That's partially true. A few became trusted confidants. One or two may have been granted land, or married off strategically. But those are exceptions. For every boy who gained favor, there were dozens who faded out of court life and into poverty, slavery, or early graves. The palace had no retirement plan for living ornaments. Tonight, we're not looking for villains or heroes. We're simply brushing dust off forgotten names, trying to hear the voices behind the marble smiles. The boys who served Roman emperors weren't just footnotes. They were lives, brief, complex, painful, and beautiful in their own tragic way. You might be wondering, were these boys simply ornaments of empire, like human jewelry, or did they wield any real power within the palace? It's a difficult question because the truth lies somewhere in the murky intersection of privilege and captivity, visibility and voicelessness. Many of the pueri delicati were lavished with gifts, praised for their appearance, and given access to rooms where few others could enter. But that doesn't mean they were free. Being close to power is not the same as having power, especially when your entire role depends on your beauty and silence. In the grand halls of Rome's imperial palaces, surrounded by mosaics and gods carved in marble, these boys were trained with extraordinary care, not in politics, not in statecraft, but in poise, obedience, and presence. Every gesture mattered. Every word spoken or unsaid was noted. Their posture, their gaze, the tilt of their heads, these were lessons taught behind closed doors by eunuch supervisors or older slaves who had survived long enough to teach the new ones. Think less education and more performance coaching. The role of the puer delicatus was closer to that of a high-wire circus act than a student. Dazzle. Please. Survive. They were often taught to sing. Music was central to the Roman court's idea of luxury and refinement. A beautiful boy with a clear, delicate voice could melt the hearts of even the most jaded senators. But it wasn't just about music, it was about control. A boy's singing voice changed with puberty. To preserve that high, almost ethereal sound, some boys were castrated before adolescence. This was horrifyingly common practice in both Roman and later European contexts. In the Roman world, it served multiple purposes. It preserved a voice, prevented sexual maturity, and symbolically erased the boy's masculine potential. It was, in a twisted way, a form of preservation. But let's talk about influence, real or perceived. Occasionally, these boys were more than just decoration. If an emperor formed a strong attachment to one, that boy might become a confidant. Imagine a 12-year-old sitting beside the most powerful man in the world, hearing state secrets, observing backroom deals, and learning which generals were worth fearing. Did he understand all of it? Maybe not. But power has a gravitational pull, and some boys absorbed it by proximity. Take the example of Elagabalus, a Roman emperor known for his extravagance and chaos. He surrounded himself with lovers of all genders and proudly elevated favorites into positions of influence. One of his most cherished companions was a boy named Hierocles, originally a charioteer. While not a puer delicatus in the traditional sense, Hierocles was young and handsome enough to catch the emperor's eye and soon found himself with status, wealth, and enemies. The same could have happened for any boy the emperor favored until, of course, that favor vanished. Favor was fickle. The same boy praised one week could be sent away the next, replaced by a younger or more intriguing version. That's the thing about being prized for your looks. You're always one wrinkle, one blemish, or one bad mood away from exile. The boys learned quickly beauty was their currency, and it had an expiration date. And what happened when a puer delicatus grew up? Well, growing up was a problem. The entire appeal of these boys lay in their youth. Once they became teenagers, especially if their bodies started to look less like Roman ideals and more like Roman soldiers, they were often cast aside. Some were freed, given minor positions in the household, or quietly married off to distant provinces. Others returned to the slave markets. A few may have taken their own lives. We don't have records of those outcomes, only the silences they left behind. Now, let's not sugarcoat this. The system was built on exploitation. Whether the boy became a whisperer of secrets or just a shadow in the emperor's corridor, his role was never chosen. It was assigned. He was groomed, not in the modern psychological sense alone, but physically, emotionally, and socially shaped to fit the desires of the empire. Rome's greatness came at a cost, and sometimes that cost was the dignity of children. Even worse, the empire wrapped this exploitation in layers of art and culture. The puer delicatus wasn't just paraded for pleasure. He was often painted, sculpted, immortalized in poetry. There are surviving frescoes of boys with soft, almost divine expressions, dancing for crowds. There are statues so lifelike. You can see the anxiety in their marble brows. Roman poets like Martial and Catullus wrote verses dripping with desire for young boys, disguising their hunger as admiration. And for a society that saw no issue with such attraction, These images became normalized, even celebrated. But this celebration didn't mean these boys were remembered with love. Their names rarely survive. Their lives weren't recorded unless they were scandalous. And the moment they lost their luster, they disappeared from the story. They weren't mourned, they were replaced. And that, perhaps, is the darkest irony of all. These boys were surrounded by power, riches, art, and yet lived like ghosts, seen but never fully human. You might ask, why are we talking about this now? Because buried history has a habit of returning. Because behind every marble statue, there may be a boy who once sang under torchlight, who once flinched at the emperor's hand, who once dreamed of growing old and free but never did. Tonight, we dust off the golden cage, and we remember those who had no voice in the empire of echoes. So now that we know who these boys were and how their beauty was curated like a precious commodity, it's time we step deeper into the emperor's private world, the gilded inner sanctum where Rome's power pulsed behind closed doors. The Roman emperor was not just a ruler, he was a god on earth, a divine figurehead whose whims shaped empires and determined life or death for millions. But what happened behind the curtains? That's where the pueri delicati often lived their lives out of sight, out of official history, but directly in the emperor's line of sight. Imagine walking through the Palatine Hill Palace, the sound of your steps muffled by thick carpets. You pass columns plated in gold, walls painted with mythical love scenes, perfumed braziers exhaling rare scents from Arabia and India, and in the shadows, you see them small figures, waiting, boys trained to bow just the right amount, smile the exact amount of deference, and never speak first. These were the emperor's personal attendants, entertainers, sometimes even companions during his long, private dinners. Each emperor had his own preferences, and the role of these boys changed depending on who was in power. For Augustus, Rome's first emperor, dignity and tradition still mattered on the surface. Anyway, there are only vague records of his inner household, but even he kept boys among his attendants, sometimes as scribes or ceremonial pages. But as we move forward into the darker, more decadent dynasties, the image becomes clearer and more troubling. Let's take Caligula. If Augustus was Rome's founding father, Caligula was its unruly, terrifying child. Sources describe his court as a place of indulgence and cruelty, where power was demonstrated not through mercy, but through humiliation. Caligula was known to call boys and girls from noble families into his private chambers for training. One infamous story tells of a young boy gifted to Caligula by a provincial governor, blonde, quiet, and dressed in a tunic sewn with pearls. The emperor is said to have placed the boy beside him during a banquet, feeding him by hand in front of stunned guests, then ordering him to sing a love song before dismissing the entire Senate in laughter. It wasn't governance. It was theater, laced with psychological terror, and boys like this were the props. Then came Nero. Nero, possibly the most infamous emperor when it comes to his relationships with young boys. He didn't just indulge, he institutionalized. Nero famously took a young boy named Sporus, castrated him, dressed him in the clothes of his deceased wife, and married him in a public ceremony. The wedding even had a dowry and priestly blessings. Roman historians wrote about this with a mix of horror and sarcasm, but rarely sympathy. Sporus was not remembered as a victim, but as a grotesque accessory to Nero's madness. That alone tells you how skewed the Roman historical lens could be. But it wasn't just about sex. The boys also became emotional placeholders. When emperors lost people they loved, they sometimes replaced them with younger versions. Nero lost his wife, he found Sporus. Elagabalus, another later emperor, surrounded himself with young men and boys who resembled former lovers, sometimes forcing them to reenact romantic scenes from poems or plays. The palace became a stage, and the boys, living props, forever expected to mirror someone else's fantasy. And yet, for all the objectification, there were moments of strange intimacy. Emperors could be lonely, surrounded by sycophants and soldiers, constantly watching for betrayal. The emperor might see the pure delicatus as a rare source of comfort, someone too small, too powerless to pose a threat. It was a twisted form of trust. These boys were allowed to see the emperor without his armor, so to speak. They were sometimes the last people he saw before sleep, the first faces he saw in the morning. They learned his moods, his temper, his appetites, and that made them dangerous, because while they had no formal power, their proximity meant they had influence, just not the kind that came with a title or authority. Whispered comments from a favored boy could turn into policies. A complaint about a rival servant could result in exile or execution. This influence was informal, invisible, and often short-lived, but while it lasted, it was real. And those who served long enough to understand it sometimes exploited it to survive. There are hints in historical records of rivalries among the emperor's inner circle between older advisors and these silent boys. The advisors had strategy, the boys had access. And sometimes, that was more valuable. A senator might wait days to gain audience with the emperor. A pure delicatus could be there when the emperor was half asleep, vulnerable, babbling secrets. So what was their daily life like? It depended on the emperor's mood. They might wake early, attend to grooming rituals, sing during private meals, or serve as messengers between the emperor and his mistresses or enemies. Some were taught poetry or music to amuse guests. Others were simply asked to stand there, still and beautiful, like human incense. At night, they might be summoned again, whether for entertainment, comfort, or darker reasons. Sleep, when it came, was a privilege, not a guarantee, and this was not a life they could speak of later. If a boy outgrew his role and was allowed to live, he rarely wrote memoirs. The risk of assassination or public shame kept most silent. The only traces we have are from bitter Roman writers or scandalized Christian commentators, people who described the boys as symptoms of corruption, not individuals with agency or emotion. But they were real. And they weren't just ornaments. They were the quiet eyes that saw everything the bloody purges, the drunken parties, the whispered plans. They were the ones who knew what the emperor looked like when the crown came off. And maybe, just maybe, they understood the empire better than any general ever could. So as you drift to sleep tonight, imagine the world's most powerful man in a room of marble and gold, surrounded not by senators or soldiers, but by silence and one boy, watching, remembering everything. Now let's zoom out for a moment and look at the machine behind all this, the vast and cruel network that fed boys into the palaces of emperors. These weren't just random children plucked from the street. The pueri delicati were selected, curated, and in many cases, traded, like fine wine, exotic animals, or rare gems. Beautiful boys became another form of elite commodity. The empire didn't just conquer land, it harvested lives. And some of those lives, small and quiet, ended up as luxury goods wrapped in silk. You've heard the saying, all roads lead to Rome. But in this case, all roads also fed Rome from the borders of Britannia to the deserts of North Africa, from the forests of Gaul to the ports of Syria. Governors, kings, generals, and merchants all knew the game. If you wanted to gain favor with the emperor, you didn't just send gold or spices. You sent what was rarest, beauty. And in Roman eyes, the most desirable beauty was often young, male, and foreign. Imagine a governor in Cappadocia, far from the center of power. He wants a promotion. He hears whispers that the emperor has a taste for boys with dark hair and green eyes. One day, a caravan arrives in his court, and among the slaves is a boy matching the description. Clean-skinned, quiet, unnervingly graceful. The governor doesn't see a child. He sees opportunity. The boy is cleaned, dressed, and taught to bow. Then, he's placed on a ship with a letter praising his virtues. He's not introduced as a slave. He's introduced as a gift, a token of admiration. And just like that, the boy's fate is sealed. And let's not forget the role of slave markets. Rome's appetite for human labor was insatiable. The empire operated one of the most extensive slave economies in history. At the height of imperial power, some scholars estimate that nearly 1/3 of the people in Rome were enslaved. And these weren't just field workers or builders. Slavery in Rome came with a hierarchy. At the top were the luxury slaves, the ones trained for music, poetry, cooking, or in this case, court life. Boys considered too beautiful for labor were placed into special categories. They were more expensive, more coveted, and more vulnerable. We have accounts of slaves being displayed like mannequins at high-end auctions. Sellers would oil the boys' skin, highlight their eyes with pigment, even force them to remain still for hours to appear docile. Buyers, often agents of noble families, would inspect them, comment on their bodies, sometimes even test their voices. If a boy passed inspection, he might be purchased and trained for years before ever entering the palace. He might never know who his parents were or where he was taken from. His entire world reduced to obedience and presentation. And then there were the favorites. Let's be clear, not all pueri delicati were equal. Some were ignored after a few weeks. Others rose to frightening levels of visibility. A favorite could become the emperor's companion in public and private, seen at festivals, banquets, even military events. While they held no official title, their proximity to the emperor made them targets of both envy and political manipulation. Take the case of Antinous. Although he was the lover of Emperor Hadrian, and perhaps not technically a pure delicatus in the strictest age category, his story reveals how far favoritism could go. Antinous, a Greek youth, captured Hadrian's heart so completely that when he died under mysterious circumstances, possibly drowned, possibly sacrificed, Hadrian deified him. That's right, he turned the boy into a god. Temples were built, coins were minted with his face. Statues of Antinous were placed all across the empire. That's the extreme. Most favorites weren't so lucky. Some were simply enjoyed for a time and then replaced. Others became scapegoats in court intrigue. If the emperor made a decision that angered the Senate, it was easy to blame bad influence from a boy behind the scenes. This allowed power players to attack the emperor's inner circle without directly confronting the throne. Jealousy in the court could be lethal. We have hints of rivalries between imperial wives and the boys they had to tolerate, between generals who resented being outranked in affection, between slaves who competed for attention. The palace was not just a house of luxury, it was a snake pit. And the pueri delicatus was often placed at the center of it all. Too young to understand the politics, but old enough to feel the danger. There are also chilling accounts of boys being gifted among elite Roman families as bargaining chips. One senator might send his favorite boy to another noble as a gesture of goodwill or, more grotesquely, as a peace offering after a political dispute. These transactions weren't hidden. They were part of the elite social fabric, dressed in the language of culture, art, and appreciation. And what did the boys get in return? The illusion of protection. Maybe nice clothes. Maybe jewelry. Maybe, if they were lucky, a few years of comfort. But as we've said before, the moment they lost favor, they were at the mercy of a system that saw them as disposable. They could be sent back to slavery, or quietly removed, or worse. So why did this system persist for centuries? Because it was useful. The emperor's moods mattered, and if a child's presence could improve those moods, the system kept feeding it. No senator wanted to be the one who said, "This is wrong," if it meant losing his position. The emperor's desire became Rome's industry. It's easy to judge this from a modern perspective, and we should, but it's also important to understand how systems of power justify themselves. Rome was a society that admired control, beauty, and order. These boys represented all three, and yet they were the least in control, the most controlled, and rarely allowed to speak. Tonight, as we sit in the quiet comfort of modern rooms, it's worth remembering that history is often written by those who got to keep speaking. The pueri delicati weren't given that chance. They were gifts, slaves, favorites, and then forgotten. But not tonight. Let's pause and ask a strange question. What happens when a boy, meant to be invisible, suddenly becomes a symbol? Not just a person, but a mirror for someone else's desires, grief, politics, or fantasies. For a few pueri delicati, that's exactly what happened. They became more than attendants. They became mythologized, romanticized, sometimes even deified. Their lives, as brief and fragile as they were, became tools in a much larger imperial story, and once they were no longer useful, they were frozen in marble, written into verse, or simply erased. In the Roman world, symbols mattered deeply. Emperors didn't just rule by decree, they ruled by image. Statues, coinage, public performances, these were all forms of messaging. When an emperor appeared with a young, beautiful boy at his side, that too was a message. Was the boy a stand-in for a lost loved one? A sign of divine favor? A living tribute to Greek aesthetics? Or simply a whisper to the Senate? I do what I want, and you won't stop me. Let's return to Antinous for a moment. While he wasn't technically a pueri delicatus, he was likely older and perhaps a consensual companion to Emperor Hadrian. His story shows just how far Rome could go in turning a boy into a symbol. After Antinous drowned in the Nile under suspicious and still debated circumstances, Hadrian plunged into mourning. He didn't just grieve. He built an entire god around the boy. Cities were renamed. A cult was founded. Statues of Antinous began appearing across the empire, showing him not as a victim or companion, but as a god of youth, healing, and resurrection. Why would Hadrian do this? Partly out of love, but also because he understood symbolism. By linking Antinous to divinity, Hadrian could wrap his grief in politics. He could connect his reign to mystery religions, to Egypt's sacred past, to Greek romantic ideals. Antinous became more powerful dead than alive. And, tragically, more admired, because that's how Rome treated beautiful boys. Alive. They were servants, dead. They could be gods as long as someone else got to write the story. This wasn't a one-off. Throughout Roman art, literature, and architecture, we find depictions of unnamed boys gently posed, lips slightly parted, eyes cast down. They are never the center of the scene, but always present, pouring wine in mosaics, playing lyres in frescoes, standing behind emperors in marble. They were designed to embody an ideal: innocence, submission, youth without voice. They weren't meant to be remembered as individuals. Their job was to be remembered as types. And that's where things get sinister. Because the more these boys were turned into symbols, the less their humanity mattered. Once you become a metaphor, your real story disappears. A boy who once had a name, a mother, a homeland becomes a sculpted jawline on a sarcophagus. A boy who may have flinched in fear becomes the muse for a love poem. A boy who may have longed to run away becomes a legend whispered in bathhouses and laughed about in Senate gossip. Roman poets were especially guilty of this. Writers like Martial and Catullus often composed verses about beloved boys, sometimes tender, sometimes vulgar, always idealized. The boys in these poems were flawless, their skin smooth, their eyes bright, their laughter musical. But they were also impossibly silent, never aging, never angry, never real. Even when a poet mentioned a boy's name, it was often just a mask, a placeholder for desire. No one asked what the boy thought, what he feared, what he wanted. And yet, these poems, sculptures, and paintings became the source material for later generations. Renaissance artists would rediscover these images and recreate them. Enlightenment thinkers would cite Roman tolerance as a model. Even in the 19th century, writers like Oscar Wilde referenced the aesthetics of Greek and Roman boy love with a wistful air of lost beauty, often ignoring the slavery, the exploitation, the lack of consent. This is the danger of forgetting the context. Because when we look at a statue of a young Roman boy today, we might admire its craftsmanship. We might even marvel at the grace and detail. But we forget that someone likely posed for that statue under threat, that the real boy may have died young, unnamed, his body discarded when it was no longer desirable. We're admiring a mask carved by power, not a portrait of a person. In rare cases, a pure delicatus might survive long enough to wield influence. Some rose to become stewards, advisors, or even lovers of the emperor in a semi-public sense. A few may have received manumission, the Roman version of freedom, and been granted land or money. But those stories are rare and often romanticized. More often, the boys vanished from records the moment they lost favor. What's more, the empire made it easy to forget them. Without legal standing, without family ties, and without property, these boys left no trail. Their stories had to be carried by those around them, and let's be honest, most people were too afraid or too complicit to speak. Even the ones who wrote scandalous histories like Suetonius or Tacitus rarely gave the boys depth. They were accessories to an emperor's shame, not humans worth mourning. So why does this matter now? Because symbols are powerful. They shape how we remember the past and how we repeat it. When we reduce human lives to decorative objects or poetic metaphors, we lose the ability to recognize suffering, and history becomes less a record of humanity and more a highlight reel of those who had the privilege to write it. The boys who served emperors didn't get to write anything. They were written about often cruelly, often falsely, but they saw everything. They stood behind thrones. They watched emperors rage, laugh, cried, and rot. They knew when a general was lying. They knew when a crown was too heavy. And yet they were expected to smile, always smile. Tonight, we remember them not as symbols, but as souls, as children forced to grow up too fast, as lives lived in the flickering torchlight of someone else's story. They were more than beautiful faces. They were witnesses, and they deserve to be remembered as more than that marble silence. So far, we've talked about the pueri delicati as ornaments, as gifts, as symbols. But there's a more painful, more complicated layer beneath all of that, a question that still haunts every historian who dares to look into these boys' stories. Were they loved, or were they merely used? It's a brutal question. And the answer, predictably, is complicated. Because in the Roman world, especially within the imperial palace, the lines between affection and exploitation were not just blurred. They were practically non-existent. Love and possession often went hand in hand. A Roman emperor might weep over a lost boy while having enslaved him in the first place. He might kiss his forehead and still threaten him with exile. He might call it love. But from the boy's perspective, it may have felt more like survival dressed in silk. Let's take a step back and examine how Romans understood love and relationships. Ancient Rome did not draw romantic lines in the way modern societies do. Love was less about equality and more about roles. In same-sex relationships, especially between adult men and boys, age, status, and power determined who could love whom, and how. The older, dominant male Erastes, if we borrow the Greek term, was expected to lead, provide, and possess. The younger, passive partner Eromenos was to be beautiful, obedient, and grateful. Consent, as we understand it today, was not part of the equation. So when an emperor claimed to love a boy, what did that really mean? It might mean he was physically infatuated. Roman literature is filled with declarations of love for smooth skin, soft voices, and delicate limbs. But it might also mean control. Love was sometimes a way of justifying ownership. If an emperor could say, "I love him," it made it easier to ignore the fact that he had bought, trained, and possibly mutilated the boy to keep him young. This twisted idea of affection was embedded in the culture. Roman moralists occasionally criticized excessive indulgence, but they rarely questioned the idea that powerful men could form romantic or sexual attachments to boys. What bothered them wasn't the abuse, it was the loss of dignity. If a Roman nobleman seemed too emotional, too public in his displays of affection for a boy, he was mocked, not for hurting the boy, but for appearing weak. In other words, the boy's suffering didn't matter. The man's image did. And yet, there are rare stories that suggest something more complicated, something that might resemble genuine emotion. The case of Hadrian and Antinous again comes to mind. Whatever the power imbalance, Hadrian was devastated by Antinous' death. His grief lasted years. He didn't just deify the boy out of political calculation. He mourned him with the intensity of a man who had lost someone central to his life. Was it love? Was it guilt? Maybe both. Maybe neither. The trouble is, Antinous never got to tell us. No puer delicatus ever did, because that's the cruelest part of all. Their voices are gone. We don't have letters from these boys, no journals, no poems that survived under their names. What we do have are texts written about them by the emperors who claimed to love them, the critics who sneered at them, or the historians who reduced them to punchlines. We are left guessing what they felt, and that guessing hurts. Imagine being 12 years old and suddenly thrust into the most dangerous, glittering environment on earth. You're dressed in fabrics worth more than your village. You're told to smile, to sing, to flatter. You're praised for being beautiful but warned not to look too proud. You're touched without warning, watched without end. And if you flinch, you're scolded. Then one night, the emperor calls for you and you're expected to be whatever he needs. A musician, a listener, a companion, maybe something else entirely. Now imagine doing this for years, never knowing if your safety depended on a joke landing, a song being sung perfectly, or your hair falling just the right way. And all the while, being told you are loved. It's no wonder that some of these boys grew up confused, angry, or numb. The rare ones who survived into adulthood often tried to vanish from public life. A few, as we mentioned, stayed near the palace and became advisors or stewards, but most disappeared. Rome had no interest in what became of them after their beauty faded. And we shouldn't pretend that this emotional exploitation was limited to boys. Girls and women in the Roman Empire faced similar patterns: arranged marriages, forced unions, and relationships built on power rather than partnership. But the puer delicatus is particularly haunting because his exploitation was framed as affection. It was wrapped in poetry, sculpture, and silk. It was called beautiful, even divine. That's why historians struggle with these stories. Not because the facts are unclear, but because the emotions are. What do we do with a world that claimed to love its victims while exploiting them? How do we talk about emperors who cried over the boys they silenced? Maybe the best we can do is listen to the silences, pay attention to the gaps, refuse to let beauty be used as a mask for pain, and remember that love, real love, cannot exist without freedom. Tonight, as you lie in the dark, imagine one of those boys not in marble, not in a poem, but real, breathing, afraid, hoping for something better. He was told he was loved, but deep down, he may have known he was just part of the furniture cherished, perhaps, but never truly seen. And now, for the first time in centuries, we are seeing him. Maybe that's the first real kindness he's ever received. Let's now descend into one of the darkest chambers of this history: quiet, cold, and so often ignored. Castration, not metaphorical, not symbolic, literal, physical, final. For some pueri delicati, this was the price of beauty, the guarantee of usefulness, and the sentence that would bind them forever to the role chosen for them. The idea was simple and horrifying. If a boy's voice was beautiful, keep it. If his body was graceful, preserve it. And if nature threatened to change either with age, stop nature. The Roman elite were fascinated with control not just of people, but of time. And puberty was their enemy. A boy could be adored at 11, but by 15, his voice might deepen, his face might grow angular, and the illusion of delicate youth would vanish. So the solution, in the eyes of emperors and their handlers, was to interfere with time, to freeze the boy at the peak of his beauty, and the only way to do that was through the blade. Roman society did not invent castration, but it certainly refined it. Castrated boys, often called spadones or eunuchi, were used across various institutions, temples, households, and, most disturbingly, imperial palaces. In some cases, the castration was partial, aimed only at preserving the voice. In others, it was total. The procedure was risky, excruciating, and often fatal. There were no antiseptics, no anesthesia, just a knife, some wine, and a prayer that the boy wouldn't die of infection or shock. And yet, many did. For every eunuch who sang sweetly in a banquet hall, there were likely dozens who bled to death in silence, buried without names in the back courtyards of noble estates. Their bodies were broken in service to aesthetic ideals. Their pain was justified by the powerful as necessary. It was all for art, for performance, for love, they claimed. But let's be honest, it was for control. The emperors and their households were obsessed with maintaining appearances. Everything had to be smooth, perfect, eternal. A castrated boy never grew into a man who might speak back, challenge authority, or remind the court of time's passing. He remained soft-spoken, passive, otherworldly. His presence soothed egos and fed illusions. In a world where emperors believed themselves gods, the puer delicatus became a sort of angel, neither child nor man, neither slave nor free, existing only to reflect the emperor's desires. And yet, he was never allowed to desire anything for himself. Castration didn't just change the body. It affected everything: the hormones, the emotions, the sense of identity. These boys often developed slower, had softer skin, and sometimes retained a childlike appearance into adulthood. To Roman society, that made them ideal. But imagine the psychological toll. To be forced into a state of eternal adolescence, to watch others grow and change while your own body was trapped, to feel the gap widen between what you looked like and what you were expected to be. And still, they had to smile. There are surviving Roman texts that treat castration as a minor detail. Such and such boy, of fine voice and gentle demeanor, preserved by the art of the physician. That's how it was written, as if it were cosmetic, as if the screams didn't matter, as if the boy didn't beg to be spared. These records don't mention consent. They don't describe fear, because the writers didn't care. The silence surrounding these procedures wasn't accidental. The court relied on it. Boys who were castrated were often removed from their homes early, kept isolated during recovery, and trained to hide their discomfort. Even among other slaves, they might be viewed with suspicion or jealousy. Their uniqueness made them valuable, but also lonely. They couldn't bond with others their age. They couldn't fully enter into Roman manhood. They belonged nowhere. And the most bitter irony, some of them were celebrated. A eunuch who survived the operation and pleased the emperor could be given gifts, praised in poems, even immortalized in art. His reward for pain and silence was more exposure, more expectations, more impossible standards. He might be given golden sandals, silken robes, and a place behind the emperor's throne, but never a future of his own choosing. In rare cases, eunuchs became powerful. They acted as gatekeepers, messengers, and even military advisors. Their perceived loyalty made them ideal for sensitive roles. After all, they had no heirs to betray the emperor for, no sexual conquest to pursue. They were seen as blank slates, pure instruments of will. But again, this trust was built on mutilation. Their loyalty wasn't earned, it was enforced through trauma. Even when Christianity later swept through the empire, the practice of castrating boys for imperial or ecclesiastical purposes didn't entirely vanish. In fact, Christian Rome repurposed the image of the eunuch as a holy figure, chaste, devout, closer to God. Some early church fathers even admired castration as a way to conquer desire. But that spiritual spin didn't erase the suffering. If anything, it made it worse by calling it noble. So tonight, as we lie comfortably in our beds, let's not flinch from this part of the story. Let's not skip the pages, because while we may want our history elegant and noble, real history is often bloody, cruel, and unspeakably unfair. The boys who were castrated to please emperors didn't choose their fate. They didn't light candles in temples or write poems about sacrifice. They just wanted to live, to grow, to become men. But Rome decided that their usefulness ended the moment their voices cracked. And so, with scalpels and lies, the empire tried to stop time. It failed. Of course, time always wins. But the scars, those were real. Those never faded. Tonight, let's remember those boys not as victims of beauty, but as children caught in a system that valued image over humanity. Their voices may be gone, but their silence still echoes in every statue. Every scroll, every page history tried to smooth over. And now, you've heard it. Let's step into the banquet hall. Golden goblets, thick incense, laughter bouncing off marble walls. Senators lounge on couches, their togas arranged just so. Peacocks roasted whole. Wine flows. Music plays. And there, in the center of it all, is a boy maybe 12, Maybe younger, his skin powdered, his hair curled and oiled, his voice trained to sing in a register high enough to float above the noise, but soft enough to never overpower the emperor's mood. He is performing, not just singing, performing obedience, performing grace, performing joy, because his survival depends on it. This was the reality for many pueri delicati. Their lives were not just lived in the palace, they were performed in it. Every day, every hour, their bodies were used to maintain the illusion of imperial serenity, whether they were pouring wine, dancing, or simply standing beside the emperor in silence. Their job was to appear perfect, and beneath that perfection, pain, fear, exhaustion, the constant ache of never knowing when a single mistake could end everything. Performance was more than theater, it was identity. These boys were expected to be multi-talented. Musicians, dancers, servers, jesters, sometimes even actors in the emperor's elaborate entertainments. Many were trained from a very young age, either in private households or directly within the palace. A promising boy might be sent to tutors who specialized in music theory, lyre performance, or vocal technique. He'd learn to modulate his voice depending on the emperor's mood, lively for feasts, solemn for funerals, flirtatious for quiet afternoons. It sounds impressive, almost glamorous, until you remember that these were children, and they weren't doing this for art or passion. They were doing it to survive. Training was relentless. If a boy failed to remember his lines, missed a note, or stumbled during a dance, he could be whipped, demoted, or simply dismissed. And dismissal rarely meant freedom. More often, it meant being sent back to the slave markets or worse. Some were gifted to other nobles. Some vanished. Performance wasn't just entertainment. It was pressure, a pressure so constant and so suffocating that it blurred the line between who the boy was and who he was forced to become. One of the cruelest parts of this system was the illusion of praise. If a boy performed well, he might be clapped for, admired, even given small gifts, coins, rings, sweets. The emperor might ruffle his hair and call him my little Orpheus or my Apollo. Other courtiers would cheer, sometimes with genuine delight, other times to curry favor. And for a moment, the boy might believe he was loved, but it was never real love. It was conditional affection, a performance of affection that vanished the moment his voice cracked or his ankle twisted during a dance. These boys lived in a house of mirrors, reflections everywhere, but no truth. There's a word that appears occasionally in Roman letters. Lepos. It means charm, elegance, sparkle, the kind of effortless grace that made people smile. The pure delicatus was expected to embody lepos at all times. No sulking, no trembling, no signs of fatigue. And if he did show fear or sadness, he was scolded or worse, replaced. Even more chilling, the audience often included people who knew better. Senators, philosophers, generals, all watching these children pretend to be joyful, all choosing not to see the fear behind the smile. Because in Rome, as in many powerful societies, truth was inconvenient, and beauty was easier to applaud than pain was to acknowledge. Of course, not all performances were musical. Sometimes the role was simply to be beautiful, to sit quietly at the emperor's feet, to fan him with a golden feather, to hold his cup with delicate fingers, to kneel beside his throne and laugh at his jokes. These too were performances, just subtler ones. And like all performances, they came with risk. Imagine what it must have felt like to be constantly watched, not just by the emperor, but by everyone in the court. Every motion scrutinized, every expression interpreted. Smile too much, and you're seen as arrogant. Smile too little, and you're ungrateful. You had to hit the perfect note always. We often think of emperors as being surrounded by guards and advisors, but their emotional needs were sometimes met by these boys. A lonely emperor might ask a pure delicatus to sing him to sleep, or tell him a story from the provinces, or simply be near silent, soft, familiar. And that might sound sweet until you realize what's happening. A child being used as emotional comfort for the most powerful man in the world. And where did the boy go when the performance ended? Nowhere. There was no backstage, no home to return to. These boys lived in the palace, slept in shared quarters, ate meals when allowed. They were always on, always ready to perform again. Their identities were swallowed by the role, until they forgot they were ever anything else. And the tragedy is, many of them were talented, genuinely gifted. Some could sing with remarkable range, play instruments masterfully, recite poetry with haunting beauty, but their talent was never nurtured for their own sake. It was weaponized, extracted, used to entertain and impress and delight, never to express. They weren't artists. They were tools, living decorations in a world that demanded perfection and punished humanity. It's no surprise, then, that some of them broke. We'll never know the names of the boys who collapsed during rehearsals. who ran away and were hunted down, who dared to speak honestly and were silenced forever. But we know they existed. And in a way, their absence in the historical record is the loudest testimony of all. Performance can be a beautiful thing, but forced performance, that's a cage, one made of gold. Maybe but a cage nonetheless. Tonight, as the lights dim in your own room, imagine the light fading in that great Roman hall. The guests are gone. The emperor has retired. And the boy, barefoot now, sits alone on the marble floor, rubbing the blisters on his feet. Tomorrow he'll sing again. Tomorrow he'll smile. But for now, just for a moment, he is himself, not a symbol, not a tool, just a child, waiting to disappear again at dawn. So by now, you might be asking something simple, something obvious, something painfully human. If so many of these boys lived and died in the heart of the Roman Empire, watched, used, praised, and paraded, how did they vanish? Where are their names, their voices, their memories? How could a civilization obsessed with record-keeping and statues forget an entire group of people who danced in front of its most powerful rulers? The answer lies not in a single event, but in a long, deliberate erosion of memory. These boys weren't just forgotten. They were buried first under layers of shame and denial, then beneath centuries of rewriting, moral judgment, and selective silence. Let's start with the most obvious eraser: the rise of Christianity. In the early centuries of the Christian Church, the Roman Empire went through a profound transformation. Pagan rituals, imperial cults, and anything that smelled of decadence were gradually swept away. With that came an aggressive re-editing of Roman history. Christian chroniclers were faced with a troubling inheritance: tales of emperors marrying boys, praising their beauty, even deifying them, to a new faith built on chastity, humility, and spiritual purity. These stories weren't just awkward, they were dangerous. So the solution was simple: hide them, or rather, sanitize them. Take away the parts that made people uncomfortable. The boy becomes a servant. The love becomes affection. The castration becomes a necessary ritual. Entire paragraphs were edited. Statues were renamed. In some cases, the faces of boys in frescoes were literally painted over given beards, aged into generic attendance, stripped of their individuality. Where a child once sang, now stood a man with no story. But this wasn't just a Christian cover-up. Even before the rise of Christianity, Roman historians themselves weren't exactly rushing to preserve the voices of the powerless. The Roman record was built by the elite. For the elite, senators, philosophers, poets, they wrote about generals and emperors, gods and battles. When they mentioned the puer delicatus, it was usually as a scandal, a joke, or an insult. No one cared what the boy thought. No one bothered to ask. And that brings us to another reason why these boys vanished. They were never supposed to be remembered. Their whole role depended on invisibility. They were meant to please, not to persist. Their job was to enhance the emperor's life, not their own. Once their usefulness ended, so did their presence. Their documents, if any existed, were discarded. Their graves were unmarked. Their stories were seen as too trivial or too shameful to record. You can almost hear the excuse echoing through history. Why write about a slave boy? Why preserve the life of someone who sang once at a dinner and then vanished? But here's the thing. Just because something isn't recorded doesn't mean it didn't happen. Just because a story isn't told doesn't mean it doesn't matter. The pueri delicati lived, breathed, suffered, and smiled real smiles. Forced smiles. Terrified smiles, whether or not anyone bothered to write their names down. And sometimes, those names do appear. In the margins. In graffiti. In the form of broken statues found in forgotten cellars. There are rare moments when archaeology uncovers a face too delicate, a pose too intimate, a tunic too finely stitched, and scholars realize this wasn't just another servant. This was a boy who once stood next to power, a boy who once performed for a god emperor, and now, a boy no one can identify. There's also the question of language. Many of these boys were from conquered territories. They didn't speak Latin as a first language. They may have spoken Gaulish, Berber, Syriac, Greek. If they did leave messages, they might not have been understood by Roman scribes. And even if those scribes could read them, they often chose not to include them. Why record the thoughts of a foreign child when you could quote Cicero instead? Add to this the natural disasters of history: fires, wars, library collapses, and you have a recipe for disappearance. But let's be honest, most of these boys were lost not through accident, but design. They were meant to be temporary, beautiful while useful, disposable once broken. But history doesn't always cooperate. Over the centuries, artists, writers, and scholars have stumbled upon their shadows. A statue here, a letter fragment there. Sometimes, The emperor's diary mentions the boy who sang on the night of Saturnalia. Sometimes, a poet writes of a pale companion with no name. These breadcrumbs, while tiny, are enough to spark questions. Who was he? What did he feel? Where did he go? And now, thanks to modern scholarship, those questions are being asked more loudly. Historians, archaeologists, and even activists are re-examining the margins of Roman history, seeking out the silenced, the forgotten, the exploited. New generations are no longer content with marble busts and imperial battles. They want the human stories, even the painful ones, especially the painful ones, because that's where empathy begins, not in the glories of emperors, but in the silences they left behind, in the rooms where a boy once stood nervous, radiant, alone, and waited for someone to see him, really see him. Tonight, you've seen him, or at least a glimpse, a whisper. And that matters. It matters because memory is power. And to remember those who were never meant to be remembered is an act of quiet rebellion. It's a way of saying, you mattered, even if they said you didn't. You were here, even if they tried to erase you. You are seen. Even now, the banquet hall is empty now. The emperor's name is etched into stone, but the boy who poured his wine, he lives in the silence between the lines. And maybe, just maybe, that's where the truest history lies. It's tempting to think of forgotten people as permanently erased names lost, voices silenced, no footprints left behind. But history has a habit of leaving traces in the most unexpected places. And for the pueri delicati, those traces are faint, fragile, and easily missed, but they're there. In the cracks of ancient walls, in the smudged ink of forgotten letters, in statues whose expressions are too tender, too real, to be purely symbolic. Rediscovery doesn't happen all at once. It comes in fragments, pieces of boys pieced together by time, curiosity, and a refusal to let silence win. Let's begin with the ruins. Archaeologists working in places like Pompeii, Herculaneum, and the Palatine Hill have uncovered frescoes and mosaics that depict scenes of palace life with unusual detail. Among them are images of young boys, not farmers, not warriors, but elegant figures in fine robes, pouring wine or plucking lyres. Their poses are almost always deferential, their features idealized. But sometimes, they're not idealized at all. Sometimes the boy's eyes are downcast in sadness. Sometimes a hand trembles slightly in the stone. These tiny breaks in perfection, these human details, are what make historians pause. Could this have been a pure delicatus? Could someone have quietly immortalized him? In one villa outside Rome, a marble relief shows a young boy cradling a lyre, seated next to a reclining man, possibly an emperor, possibly a patron. The boy's face is unusually detailed. High cheekbones, full lips, eyes that seem to hold a mix of fear and trust. There's no inscription, no name, but the craftsmanship suggests he mattered to someone. Was it love, gratitude, or a quiet apology from the artist who knew the boy's story would otherwise vanish? And then there are the statues, so many statues. Most don't have names. Some were believed to be gods or muses. But when researchers look closely, patterns emerge. A particular tilt of the head, a repeated hairstyle favored in imperial circles, clothing too fine for a servant, too delicate for a citizen. These figures, some scholars argue, are not mythological. They're portraits idealized. Yes, but based on real boys who served, sang, suffered. Each statue becomes a potential resurrection, a chance to look into the eyes of someone history tried to forget. But physical evidence isn't the only trail. Letters, those private, messy, accidental time capsules, have offered glimpses into the boys' lives. Not letters from the boys, sadly, but letters that mention them. Notes from senators complaining about the emperor's latest indulgence. Private correspondence between nobles warning their sons not to send gifts like the Greeks do. Even casual lines in philosophical tracts, where a writer might condemn those who place garlands on singing boys while Rome burns. Sometimes, these comments are cruel. Other times, they're curious. But even the cruelty is useful because it confirms what official histories tried to erase. It tells us that these boys were there, that people saw them, that their presence was controversial, undeniable, unforgettable. And in a world that pretended they didn't matter, being unforgettable is a kind of victory. One of the most poignant rediscoveries came not from Rome, but from a rural estate in Gaul. During renovations of a wine cellar, workers found a piece of pottery with graffiti scrawled on the inside. It read, in rough Latin, "He sang even when he cried." I wish he'd sung longer. No name, no date, just that, was it written by a fellow servant, a lover, a patron? We'll never know. But the emotion bleeds through the clay. That boy was real. Someone remembered. And what about literature? Modern scholars have returned to Roman poetry with sharper eyes. Where older historians read verses about divine youths as allegory or fantasy, newer interpretations look for clues. Who were these boys? Were they based on real people? Could the constant references to liars, curls, pale skin, and tearful eyes be more than poetic devices? Could they be tiny windows into real relationships? Real tragedies, hidden in plain sight? It turns out that poetry, like ruins, holds secrets. Consider the poet Statius, who once wrote of a boy who sang sweeter than the birds of spring, and whose absence turns wine sour. That sounds like typical poetic excess until you realize that the boy is described in terms that match court traditions: gold-threaded tunic, perfumed curls, and a posture taught by silence. That's not an imagined muse. That's someone who existed. And perhaps, in some small way, that poem is all that's left of him. In recent years, even museums have begun to reassess their collections. Statues once labeled youthful Apollo or unknown court servant are being re-examined. Some institutions have started adding new plaques, noting the possible identity of the subject, the cultural practice of displaying pueri delicati, and the ethical complications of exhibiting such art without context. It's not much, but it's a start, because rediscovery isn't just about unearthing bones or translating scrolls. It's about remembering with intent, about choosing to ask questions that others ignored, about looking at a statue not with admiration for its smooth marble, but with empathy for the child who had to stand that still, that long, that silently, to inspire it. And perhaps the most important rediscovery of all is the one happening right now, in your mind. As you listen, imagine, absorb. You're giving life back to boys who were told they had none. You're lifting them from the background, turning them from props into people. That matters more than any museum plaque. Because in the end, history is not a wall of facts, it's a field of voices. And some of those voices are so faint. You have to lean in, quiet your thoughts, and really listen. So tonight, in this quiet moment, as ruins sleep under stars and letters fade on dusty shelves, remember, someone once sang, even when he cried. Someone once danced, even when his feet bled. Someone once smiled, knowing it might be the last time. And now, someone remembers. Let's imagine, just for tonight, that one boy made it through, that a name slipped through the cracks of time, not intact, but enough for us to breathe life back into it. No, this isn't a biography, there's no full record, no journal, no autobiography etched into stone. But sometimes, the smallest details are enough to tell a story. And so, from fragments of sculpture, faded graffiti, and the sterile language of court records, we begin to piece together the whisper of a life once lived, a life that began like so many others in silence, in service, and in shadow. His name was Silvanus. At least, that's what a small inscription suggests. Silvano, Carus Augusti to Silvanus, beloved of the emperor, found on a chipped piece of marble, barely larger than a hand, buried beneath centuries of debris in what had once been the gardens of the Domus Augustana. No year, no sculptor's name, just a boy's name and a chilling phrase that tells us everything and nothing at all. We don't know where he came from. His name, Silvanus, is Latin, meaning of the forest. It could have been his real name, or a new one given to him when he entered the palace, a romantic label for a boy who had no choice in his path. Maybe he was from Gaul, or Illyria, or perhaps the northern reaches of Hispania. Taken from his village, perhaps not even understanding the language of the men who sold him, he would have arrived in Rome wide-eyed and terrified. He would have been cleaned, assessed, and trained. An older eunuch might have taken charge of him, teaching him how to walk without sound, how to bow without looking awkward, how to serve without appearing too eager. He'd have been given a new tunic, perfumed oils, perhaps even a lyre to hold, whether or not he knew how to play it. He wasn't there to be himself. He was there to be what others wanted. Silvanus may have caught the emperor's eye during a feast, his quiet demeanor mistaken for refinement, his fear mistaken for poise. From that moment on, his life would not have been his own. Moved into the private quarters, given better food, finer clothes, and a place of honor at the emperor's feet. He would have become visible, but only in one direction. He could be seen, not heard, touched, not consulted, praised, but never protected. The inscription calls him Carus Augusti, beloved of the emperor. That single phrase, so tender on the surface, is loaded with ambiguity. Was it affection, lust, possession? Did Silvanus feel honored? Trapped? Both. Did he understand the emperor's smile as kindness or a signal to prepare for another night of quiet endurance? No record survived to explain the nature of their relationship, but the pattern is familiar. Silvanus would have been expected to sing, to accompany the emperor during walks in the garden, to laugh at his jokes during slow dinners. He might have been told he was special, unique, that he would be cared for forever. But such promises, in the Roman court, were as cheap as pottery, beautiful, breakable, and easily replaced. One Roman historian mentions a forest-born boy with honeyed voice who once calmed the emperor's anger during a Senate outburst. Was that Silvanus? No way to be sure. But the story aligns with others boys used to temper imperial moods. Their very presence expected to soothe, like human incense. If that boy was Silvanus, then for one brief moment, his performance wasn't just for entertainment. It was survival his own, and maybe that of the senators spared a wrathful decree. There's also a statue, or rather, what's left of one, discovered near the Temple of Apollo. It shows a young boy seated beside a large lyre, eyes turned downward, lips parted slightly, not singing, but perhaps about to. The marble is worn, one foot is missing, but the tenderness in the sculpting is unmistakable. His robes are too fine for a servant, his expression too vulnerable for a god. A small, almost hidden inscription on the base reads, Silvano. That's it. No titles, no claims of virtue, just a name. Maybe it was commissioned by someone who loved him, or someone who regretted him, or someone trying to remember what everyone else was trying to forget. What happened to Silvanus? There are three possible endings, and none of them are happy. The first is exile. Once the emperor lost interest, perhaps when Silvanus's voice changed, or a new favorite arrived, he may have been sent away, given to a distant household, or quietly discarded. The second is disease. Roman courts were rife with illness. A boy as sheltered and emotionally drained as Silvanus might not have survived even a minor fever. The third possibility is the most likely, and the most heartbreaking. He died young, still in service, and was buried without ceremony. The marble fragment could have been a token marker, placed in a private garden where the emperor could remember him when the mood struck. But not too often. Memory, after all, is dangerous in places built on forgetting. And yet, despite all of this, despite the erasure, the silence, the loss, here we are, saying his name, Silvanus. He may have lived 2,000 years ago. He may have sung once at midnight under Roman stars. He may have been loved or used or both. But tonight, you remember him? And in doing so, you undo just a little of the empire's silence. Because sometimes, all it takes is a name. Sometimes, a chipped piece of marble is more powerful than a legion. Sometimes, the whisper of a statue is louder than a scroll of laws. And sometimes, the smallest voice in the palace, one that never got to speak, can echo across centuries and be heard again. Silvanus may never have had a choice. But now, he has a story. And you, for a moment, have listened. After all these parts of the story, after the statues, the letters, the ceremonies, and the silence, we must return to one of the hardest, most uncomfortable questions. Did anyone truly love these boys? Not the kind of love sung in odes or etched in marble. Not the possessive, political kind, but something human, something real, something that says, I see you. I care if you live or die. I want your happiness, not your performance. For the pueri delicati, love was a dangerous illusion. Rome had many words for affection: amor, caritas, pietas, delectio, benevolentia. But few of these describe the kind of mutual, equal love we hope for today. Roman love was built on hierarchy. A citizen loved his wife by controlling her. A general loved his men by leading them to victory. A master loved his slave by not beating him that day. To love a pure delicatus, a boy selected for his beauty and silence, was often to conflate affection with ownership. And yet, the stories are not entirely one-sided. That's what makes them so complex and so haunting. Let's imagine a Roman emperor, late at night, seated on a couch with wine-stained lips. At his feet, a boy sits quietly, hands folded, face turned toward the moonlit courtyard. The emperor leans down and says, "You are the only one I trust." The boy says nothing. He can't tell whether this is truth, manipulation, or just drunken sentiment. He can't risk believing it, but it might be the kindest thing he's heard in years. That's the trap of being wanted. You begin to mistake it for love. Many of these boys, we suspect, learned to read the signs. They learned how to tilt their heads just right, when to touch an emperor's sleeve, when to lower their gaze. They learned how to become the mirror that made the emperor feel most powerful. And sometimes, they were rewarded with kind words, with sweet gifts, with temporary safety. Is that love? The historians of the time rarely asked. They were more interested in the scandal. Suetonius, for instance, was quick to mock emperors for having boy wives, but showed no interest in how the boys felt about it. Tacitus mentioned the rumors but avoided the emotional consequences. Even Christian chroniclers, who condemned the practice as immoral, were more focused on the sin than the suffering. None asked, did the boy feel seen, protected, respected? Because, of course, they didn't care. To them, the puer delicatus was part of the emperor's furniture, golden, controversial, but lifeless. And yet, small clues leak through. One surviving letter between two Roman court officials describes the little one who weeps when the emperor leaves for war. Another mentions an emperor who refused to eat after the death of his favorite boy. Were these signs of real emotion, real grief, or just more performative decadence? We don't know, but it forces us to confront the uncomfortable possibility. Sometimes, the love was real but still wrong. Because love without freedom isn't love. Love that demands silence isn't love. Love that cannot survive age, illness, or rebellion is not love, it's fantasy. And for the boys of Rome, fantasy was a gilded prison. Even the most seemingly affectionate relationships had their limits. The moment the boy aged, fell ill, or lost favor, the warmth evaporated. There was always another gift waiting in the provinces, another beautiful face ready to be trained. Loyalty flowed one way upward. The emperor's gaze was the sun. If he turned away, the boy was left in the cold. But let's not be naive. Not all emperors were monsters. Some may have genuinely believed they loved these boys. They may have cherished their company, wept for their deaths, even mourned them in private. The story of Hadrian and Antinous is the most famous example. After Antinous drowned in the Nile, Hadrian was reportedly inconsolable. He built temples in the boy's name, founded a city, and deified him. That's not the act of a man who didn't feel loss. But love rooted in power is never clean. It may be sincere, but it's not safe. We must also ask whether the boys ever loved in return. Could they? Some might have. A child raised in the palace, surrounded by opulence, might have confused dependency for devotion. He might have clung to the emperor as the only familiar face in a terrifying world. He might have believed the words whispered at night. He might have chosen to believe. That's what makes it all so tragic. Real feelings may have bloomed in a soil poisoned by coercion. A boy might have looked up at the emperor not just with fear, but with longing. Not because he had been brainwashed, but because humans are capable of attaching even to those who harm them. It's called survival. And sometimes, it masquerades as love. Even today, survivors of similar abuse often wrestle with these emotions. Did I care about them? Did they care about me? Was I special? Or just lucky not to be hurt more? The pueri delicati. Had they lived in a world where they could speak, might have asked the same questions. But they didn't live in such a world, and they couldn't ask. So we must ask for them. Perhaps the better question is not were they loved, but were they ever free to be loved in a way that didn't require obedience, silence, or pain? And the answer is likely no. So where does that leave us? With discomfort. And that's okay. History shouldn't always make us feel good. Sometimes, its purpose is to remind us how easily human dignity can be traded for beauty, how quickly desire can become domination, how thoroughly power can corrupt even the gentlest gesture. But it also leaves us with a mission, to remember these boys not just as victims, but as people who tried to find warmth in a cold system, who may have felt love, even if it was never safe, who may have offered kindness, even when it was never returned. Tonight, as you lie in the dark, think of them not as forgotten ornaments of the past, but as hearts that beat once awkwardly, hopefully, maybe even joyfully, if only for a moment. Maybe someone once ran their fingers through a boy's curls and meant it. Maybe someone once whispered, "You matter." Maybe a boy once believed it. And maybe now, so do you. Let's pull back from the individual stories now and look at the world that made all of this possible. A world where gender was not fixed but performed, where beauty was not innocent but weaponized, where power did not just rule over the body, it shaped it, curated it, and judged it from the tips of one's curls to the smoothness of one's skin. To understand the pueri delicati, we must understand how Rome viewed gender and beauty, and how those ideas were used to justify everything from admiration to abuse. Modern categories like male, female, gay, straight, or non-binary don't neatly map onto Roman thinking. In fact, they miss much of the complexity. Romans were obsessed not with gender as identity, but with gender as status. What mattered wasn't what you were, but how you behaved. Were you dominant or passive? Were you in control, or were you controlled? Power was everything, and anyone who could be used was seen as lesser regardless of what body they were born into. That's where the puer delicatus entered this strange moral framework. He was biologically male, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that he was small, pretty, compliant, and therefore feminized. Not in the way we understand femininity today, but in the sense of lacking power, lacking control, and being desirable to someone with more authority. To be penetrable, in Roman thought, was to be socially inferior. It didn't matter who you were. If you were the object of someone else's control, your masculinity and therefore your dignity was diminished. This twisted logic is what made the pure delicatus both desirable and disgraceful. He was a paradox, admired for his beauty, but mocked for his softness, displayed at banquets, but never respected. He could make a room laugh or weep with a song, but he would never be quoted in a Senate speech. And worst of all, the older he got, the more grotesque he became in the eyes of Roman society, because a grown man who still carried the traits of a boy was seen as unnatural, embarrassing a failed version of both manhood and youth. This obsession with beauty, youthful, fragile, controllable beauty, was not unique to Rome, but Rome institutionalized it. The empire had an entire aesthetic built around the ideal male youth. Gods like Apollo, Ganymede, and Narcissus weren't just mythological figures. They were role models for what Roman elites believed a beautiful boy should look like. Pale skin, soft limbs, a gentle voice, delicate wrists. Statues of these figures appeared everywhere. In bathhouses, villas, public gardens. Their likeness became the template. And into that template stepped the poor delicatus, not by choice, but by force. He was shaped to fit it, punished when he didn't, discarded when he couldn't. His hair was curled to resemble Ganymede. His tunics were tailored to mirror Apollo. He became a living myth while his real self was buried beneath silk and discipline. But it wasn't just the emperors who participated in this aesthetic. The entire Roman elite did. Senators kept houseboys trained to sing and serve. Patrons gifted young servants to one another as gestures of loyalty or dominance. Poets wrote verses praising the curve of a boy's neck with the same reverence they used for military victories. Beauty wasn't just admired, it was a tool, a currency, a political signal. And yet, the moment someone spoke too directly about the implications, shame entered the picture. Romans were very good at public denial. A man could display his favorite boy in court, but if someone accused him of improper conduct, he'd act insulted. Of course not. I admire his poetry. The hypocrisy was baked into the culture. Desire was expected, even praised until it threatened someone's reputation. Then it was scandalous. Then the boy was labeled the corrupter. Then silence became safety again. Gender, too, was manipulated at will. Boys were dressed in feminine fabrics, made to walk with controlled grace, stripped of any markers of adult masculinity. Castration only heightened this transformation. A eunuch wasn't just a boy without sexual maturity, he was, in Roman eyes, an entirely different category of person. Not fully male, not fully female, but something in between, something useful, something safe to love. Because they could never rival the lover, this is where the cruelty sharpens. Because these boys weren't just victims of individuals, they were victims of ideas. Ideas about what beauty should look like. Ideas about what love could excuse. Ideas about what made a person human. And once you become an idea to other people, your actual self no longer matters. The pure delicatus was not allowed to be angry, or messy, or awkward. He had to be perfect. And perfection, in Rome, was often a form of violence. And yet, they were never truly invisible. Even in art designed to objectify them, hints of their resistance shine through. A statue with a clenched jaw. A painting where the boy's eyes are focused not on the viewer, but away somewhere distant. Unreachable. A poem that accidentally reveals too much sadness, too much awareness. You start to see the cracks in the myth. And through those cracks, a person emerges. Not just a symbol. A boy. Maybe he hated the emperor. Maybe he cried when no one was looking. Maybe he stole extra figs from the kitchen and shared them with other boys. Maybe he dreamed of running away, even if he didn't know where. Maybe, for a moment, he stood in a mirror and wondered who he really was beneath the lace and perfume. Not a statue, not a favorite, just himself. But Roman power didn't allow for such selfhood. The emperor's gaze was total, and to exist outside it was to vanish. So the boys became what was expected. They performed gender like a mask. They wore beauty like a shackle. And for a time, they were praised for it. And then, as always, they were replaced. Tonight, as you sit with this knowledge, remember that these weren't mistakes in the system. They were the system. Rome didn't accidentally harm these boys. It built a world where their suffering was normal, accepted, celebrated. And that's why we must not just tell their stories. We must question the world that created them. Because these ideas about beauty, about power, about who gets to be seen didn't die with the empire. They linger, they mutate, and they still shape lives today. So let us look harder. Let us question what we admire. Let us ask who gets to speak and who is told to smile instead. Let us, finally, stop mistaking silence for consent. And now, here we are at the edge of the empire. At the end of a story that never really had a beginning, a story buried under marble, rewritten by emperors, ignored by scholars, and denied by those who preferred their history neat and noble. But you've stayed this long. You've listened. You've let the silence speak. And so, there's one final question worth asking. Why does it matter to remember the pueri delicati? Why stir the ashes of forgotten boys who lived and died 2,000 years ago? Because history isn't just a timeline. It's a mirror. And what we choose to forget says as much about us as what we choose to remember. The boys who served Roman emperors were not rulers, not generals, not writers. They left behind no great works, no buildings, no public reforms. They didn't have the luxury of legacy, but they were there, in the palace halls, in the shadow of power, in the margins of every victory parade and banquet and imperial decree. And they mattered. They mattered because they were human. They laughed sometimes for real, sometimes because they had to. They cried quietly. When no one was watching, they sang lullabies to emperors and were expected to soothe men who controlled armies. They were told they were special, then discarded when they grew too tall, too tired, too aware. And through it all, they were invisible. That invisibility is exactly why they must be remembered. To tell the story of Rome without them is to tell a lie of omission. It is to pretend the empire was built only by heroes and philosophers, not by children trained to entertain those heroes and flatter those philosophers. It is to turn trauma into background music. It is to let power define whose suffering counts. But when we remember the pueri delicati, we challenge that narrative. We say, this child mattered. His pain was real. His life had weight. His silence was not consent. His smile was not proof of joy. He was not a myth or a statue or a literary device. He was a boy. And perhaps, in a strange way, remembering them offers something to us, too. Because when we acknowledge their stories, we begin to see the patterns that still exist. We notice who is expected to smile without complaint, who is praised for being beautiful but punished for being loud, who is made a symbol before they are allowed to be a person. And we are reminded uncomfortably, necessarily, that some systems of exploitation don't end with the fall of an empire. They just change form. This is why memory is resistance. When we speak the names that history tried to erase, we shift the power. When we tell stories that make people uncomfortable, we expand the boundaries of compassion. And when we mourn those who were never mourned, we begin to make space for justice not in the courtroom, but in the conscience. It's easy to remember the emperors. Their faces are on coins. Their speeches fill scrolls. Their tombs are grand and arrogant and still stand. But the boys, their graves were shallow. If they had any stones, they were unlabeled. If they were buried in gardens, they were forgotten when the gardens were paved. If they were buried under the palace, they were never spoken of again, except not anymore. Now, you've spoken them. In your mind, with your time, with your attention. That matters. And it's not about guilt. You didn't build the empire. You didn't silence those children. But you can be part of something better, something slower, quieter. More just, you can be the kind of person who listens to the stories that weren't meant to survive. You can ask the questions others are too polite or too afraid to ask. Like, who was that boy in the painting? Why does that statue look so sad? Why are all the records about the emperor and none about the child at his side? You might never get an answer, but asking is its own act of love. In the end, remembrance is not about perfection. It's about presence. You were here. You heard. You carried a truth that the empire tried to bury. That matters. Tonight, maybe you'll sleep a little differently. Not because this was a horror story, but because it was a human one. Maybe you'll see beauty with new eyes. Maybe you'll ask deeper questions about power, silence, and the cost of performance. Maybe you'll walk past a statue tomorrow and wonder who the real person behind it might have been. And maybe, just maybe, you'll say their name. Not the emperors, the boys. Whisper it. Invent one. If you have to, let it sit in your chest like a heartbeat. Because somewhere, long ago, a boy sang for a man who would never truly hear him. And now, you have, this is how the empire ends, not with swords, but with stories. Not with glory, but with honesty. Not with forgetting, but with the quiet, stubborn act of remembrance. You did that. Thank you for listening. So now, as your eyes grow heavier and your thoughts begin to slow, let's leave behind the marble corridors, the echoing footsteps, the flickering torchlight that once lit the emperor's chambers. We've walked through a world built on spectacle and silence. We've stood beside children who were made into symbols and forgotten as people. And we've done something that those in power never wanted us to do. We remembered them. You don't need to carry their names in your pocket or their faces in your mind. You just need to carry the feeling, that quiet sense of injustice that whisper of empathy, that gentle awareness that beauty should never cost someone their freedom. History isn't always grand battles and mighty speeches. Sometimes, it's a boy sitting quietly in a palace, trying not to cry because the emperor might notice. And in remembering that boy, you've made the past a little more honest. As the night deepens and the world outside your window softens into silence, take a breath. Feel the stillness. Let the weight of these stories settle gently. You don't need to fix the past. You just need to bear witness. So dim the lights a little more. Let the echoes fade. Let your thoughts unravel like thread, loose and quiet. You've done enough for tonight. You've listened. You've learned. And maybe, just maybe, you've helped someone who had no voice find a place however small in the world again. Now sleep well, dream softly, and let the marble halls of the empire crumble behind you. You're safe, and you are seen. Good night.